William Everett is a 19th century congressman, and he loved to tell the story about a church in England that needed new hymnals. And the church could not afford it, and they came across a company that sold patent medicines that was willing to sell them, help them purchase a hymnal at 1 penny apiece if it contained a little bit of advertising. And the congregation didn't think they thought it was all right. They would maybe just kind of put their hand over the patent medicine. And so the hymn books, they were delivered the day before Christmas. And on Christmas morning, the pastor looked out at the congregation. And he says, okay, everyone turn to page 240. And everyone turned to hymn number 240. And as they started singing, they all gasped at the same time. As they sang, "Hark the herald angels sing, Beecham's pills are just the thing. Peace on earth and mercy mild, 2 for man and 1 for child." The commercialization of Christmas, it's not just a modern phenomenon. You see, there's a lot of pressure on us during this Christmas season. It's the end of the year, and if you run a business, you know you've got your end of the year reports, and you got to make sure that things are in the black. It's the end of the semester. And I think we heard a collective sigh of relief of every student in the Panhandle last week as school ended. We also have to fit in numerous and countless dinners and functions and programs. I mean, we don't have time to feel joy. There's too much to do. And more than that, there's too much to worry about. And that's why we are talking about joy this month, specifically the theology of joy. Because this is a time of huge contrast. If you remember a few weeks ago, we talked about the very definition of joy, which is this feeling of great pleasure right now. But we soon learned that the Bible not only has that definition of joy, but also another one that talks about hope. And that we have hope because of something that God has done for us in the past. And we hope that God will help us continue to see and seek that assurance in the future. And then we spent some time talking about Mary here. And we learned that joy occurs when we realize that God's plan goes to the lowest of society. Joy is not found with those who have power, with those who have prestige, with those who have wealth. It is found through a 13-year-old girl from Nowheresville who taught us a thing or two about humbleness. And then last week we picked up on the joy that we learned on the backside of sorrow. Joseph, Jesus' earthly father, knew a bit about this sorrow. And if you remember, we talked about the 7 sorrows of Joseph. And we learned that with each moment of strife and difficulty, on the backside of that is joy. So today we come to our final lesson in this season of Advent. And we learn that joy is found when we put aside worry and focus on something else. And since we're pursuing a biblical definition of joy for us this month, we're going to look to see how Paul defines it. And so Max is going to read us a portion of his letter to the church in Philippi.
Our reading this morning is from Philippians chapter 4, verses 4 through 7. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. The Lord is near. Do not worry about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Jesus Christ.
Thank you, Max. There's several things that jump out at me at this text. But the first thing that really pops out is 2 words, besides rejoice. And it's peace and gentleness. Those are 2 words that I hear very prominently here. But before we get into that, I want to look at why indeed Paul is writing this passage. In the first chapter of Philippians, we learn that Paul is in jail. Now, he and Silas have been dragged before the city officials, not because they were preaching about Jesus. In fact, in Roman society, anyone could worship whoever they wanted. The problem was they were preaching about Jesus and how you should worship only God, and that's it. You see, the Roman emperor was considered a god. And when your leader is considered a god, you must worship the leader, the god. You must worship the emperor first, and then after that, spend time, you can worship whoever you want after that. So this is what we know. We know that Paul is in jail, and we know that he's about to be executed for treason. This certainly was a capital crime. And in the midst of this, he says, peace and gentleness. Now, before we get to those two words, I got to share with you a moment of personal joy. Last week, we had our Christmas performance, and there was a couple of things that really stood out for me. First, do you realize this is the first time that we used the stage since the remodel? And what I loved was how the lighting shined directly on the story itself, and it helped us to focus just on that. But then after that fantastic performance, we had a guest. And I'll tell you, the look I saw on the faces when I announced that Santa Claus was here was absolutely precious. And it got me thinking, why is Santa so unique at this time? Now, I think, one, we could point to the presents. We certainly could look to the magic of the season. But I think it has something, there's something else. And it has to do with the research that I'm doing. In February, we're going to be talking about this guy, Mr. Rogers. And in my research, I found two words that really stood out: kind and gentle. And when you think about Santa Claus, we don't think about some grumpy old man in a red suit. We don't even think of Krampus, which is the German version of Santa Claus that scares kids into being good. No, when we think of Santa Claus, we think of kind and gentle. We think of peace. And as we're going to find out in that sermon series about Mr. Rogers, this is indeed what he taught. This is exactly how he made kids feel. And it's why our children are drawn to Santa Claus, because it's how he makes them feel. He reminds them of peace, of kindness, of gentleness, and certainly of joy. Michael Thigpen writes in an article called Discipleship Journal. He describes kind of the story that kind of goes along with this. He says, I remember coming home one afternoon to discover that the kitchen I had worked so hard to clean only a few hours before was now a terrible wreck. My young daughter had obviously been busy cooking, and the ingredients were scattered along with dirty bowls and utensils across the counters and floor. I was not happy with the situation. Then as I looked a little more closely at the mess, I spied a tiny note on the table, clumsily written and smeared with chocolatey fingerprints. The message was short. I'm making something for you, Daddy. And it was signed, Your Angel. In the midst of that disarray, and despite my irritation, joy suddenly sprang up in my heart, sweet and pure. My attention had been redirected from the problem to the little girl I loved. As I encountered her in that brief note, I delighted in her. With her simple goodness and focus, I could take pleasure in seeing her hand at work in a situation that seemed otherwise disastrous. Now, I want you to note something that Michael Thigpen is going to say, and I want you in your mind to think about what Paul writes in his letter to the church at Philippi. Just listen to what Michael Thigpen says. The same is true of my joy in the Lord. Many times life looks rather messy. I can't find much to be happy about in my circumstances. Nevertheless, if I look hard enough, I can usually see the Lord behind it all, or at least working through it, making something for me. So what kind of mess are we looking at today? Christmas is 2 days away. Does that mean last-minute shopping, or maybe just getting started shopping? One more family gathering, or maybe the start of many? What about work obligations? I remember sitting where you are. I know tomorrow is going to be a crazy day. It is a short work day, which means no breaks, no lunch hour, because you got to get everything done before the bank or whatever where you work at, so you can get out early so you can go to Christmas Eve. Now, these really aren't a mess. It's just how we feel right now. There is a rush and an anxiety that comes with this period that we just can't get away from. And then you add that Friday was the least amount of sun that we had all year, and we realize why nerves are so frayed and so short right now. And in the midst of this, Paul says, rejoice. In fact, he says this twice. Do not be anxious about anything. He is sitting in prison. He is waiting the gallows, and he writes that this should be the happiest time of our life. Really? Really? Basically, he's saying, don't worry, be happy. Now, those words from the famous theologian, Bobby McFerrin, you know, that guy made a lot of money off those 4 words. And now, no, I'm not going to have Lois come out and strum it on the guitar like she did last week. You're just going to have to hum it and whistle it to yourself today. But the quote actually comes from an Indian mystic by the name of Meher Bebe, and his name just means compassionate father. Now, here's the interesting thing about Meher Bebe, is in 1925 he took a vow of silence, and he did not utter one word until he died in 1969. Imagine that. He would just kind of communicate with his followers using a form of alphabetical works and maybe some hand gestures. But he would do all these works of charity. And then when he would communicate with people outside of India, he would always use the short phrase, don't worry, be happy. And it caught on in the 1960s. You find these posters. You would see this picture of Bebe with the words, don't worry, be happy. And in fact, that's where McFerrin saw the poster. And he designed a whole song around it. And in 1988, McFerrin said in an interview, whenever you see a poster of Meher Bebe, it usually says, don't worry, be happy, which is a pretty neat philosophy in 4 words, I think. Pretty neat philosophy in 4 words. You know, I think McFerrin and Bebe did a pretty good job at getting us to think about joy. But I think it was Paul's emphasis on peace and gentleness it kind of takes this theology of joy up a notch. Because when it comes to worry, I consulted an expert. Me. You see, I grew up in a household that had a prominent plaque on the wall that said, I know worry works. Because you know what the rest of it says? 90% of what I worry about never happens. That plaque is so true, especially for worriers. In fact, it practically gives us license to worry. So to help with this message, I decided to sit down and list all the things that I worried about just this week. And this is what I came up with. My sermon. And I listed 5 things to worry about with my sermon. I worried about our staff Christmas party. I worried about getting gifts for Sarah. I worried about Christmas Eve. And it gave me several other things to worry about. I worried about our Christmas signs. I worried that I'm going to get a cold on Christmas Day because I can tell I'm fighting something. I worried about these aches and pains in my body from my knee and heel and my Achilles and my elbow. I worried about my dog who's getting old. I worried about my kids and their semester and what they're looking at next year. I worried about the Cornhuskers. And I worried about you. And I thought about the worries that you are going through right now. And as I begin to put this list on my wall and look at this, I began to worry that I was worrying too much. And I played that song in my head, Don't Worry, Be Happy. And then I reread verse 6. And I noticed something that was there the whole time, but I just never caught on to it. Let your requests be made known to God. Here is the key to the theology of joy. Bobby McFerrin says we shouldn't worry and just be happy. But Paul is saying, okay, don't worry, but if you do, just take it all to God and peace and gentleness and understanding will come over you. Our youth group likes to watch videos that help us allow and provide some lesson. So we like to go to YouTube and look at videos on YouTube. and then speak a lesson around it. And a few weeks ago, we lifted up one video that has become kind of a favorite of ours. And I think it does a pretty good job in describing joy. So we're going to watch this short video right now.
My mama told me something when I was growing up that has forever changed my life. She played the piano at our little church at 3rd and Pine Street for 37 years. She tried to teach me to play the piano, but I wasn't very good. She would teach me the names of the notes, what a major key is, what a minor key is. She tried to teach me musical theory, but I was just bored. Then, one day, she told me that the best news in the world is found by playing a simple scale on the piano. I had no idea what she meant, so she told me to play an 8-note scale. So I did. I said, "How is that good news?" And she said I played it incorrectly and that I needed to play it the other way. So I did. Again, I said, "How is that good news?" And she said, "I played it the right way, but I needed to add the pauses." The pauses? She said, "The pauses. Add them on the first, second, fourth, sixth, seventh, and last note." Now, I was frustrated and said, "How can 8 notes with random pauses be the best news in the world?" Then I got up, walked away, and went outside. Frankly, I didn't care what she was talking about. I didn't like playing the piano anyway. Well, years later, my mama got sick and passed away. As I was thinking about her, I remembered what she told me about the piano. Not only that, I still remember the notes she told me to pause. The first, second, fourth, sixth, seventh, and last note. So I sat down at her piano and played the scale with the pauses. And that's when I realized the good news she was talking about.
Now I know all of you are going to go home and play it on your own piano, right? Isn't that a great video? You know, my friends, I know one sermon is not going to make your anxiety go away. I know one song will not make this the perfect Christmas ever. I know that one sermon series will not make you feel joyous, especially if you don't feel joy right now. But maybe one of the scriptures that was mentioned, maybe one of the stories that was lifted up, maybe one of the songs that was shared, maybe one of the insights that was brought forth will make a difference, because at its core, that is what this season is all about, correct? We really want things to be different. We don't like the anxiety we feel. We don't like that poverty exists in this world. We don't like that our neighbors and friends and family members are not getting along. We don't like that some people feel joy and we might be in the doldrums right now. And at its core, that is the message of joy this season. Joy does not mean that we walk from Thanksgiving to Christmas Day with a huge smile on our face. Joy means taking our worries and our troubles and our anxieties and laying them at the very feet of God. Joy means that right now, you might be going through a rough patch, and that we trust that we will get through it. Joy means that the promise of the coming of the Christ child was not just an event, not something that happened 2,000 plus years ago, not something that means nothing. Joy means that it was all worth it, and it will be better. Don't worry, be happy, and send those requests to God. And when we do, we just might find peace and gentleness and joy. was a snowy Christmas Eve. Inside that warm house, the Christmas tree was cheerfully ablaze with lights and surrounded by dozens of presents, just like up here. The man's wife and children were dressed and ready to leave for church. "Come with us," they urged him. They loved their dad so much. "Not me," he snapped. "I don't believe all that religion garbage." For many years, the man's wife had been trying to tell him about Jesus and the salvation he offers and how God's Son had become a human being in order to show them the right path and the way. "Nonsense," the man snapped back. He'd always say. So the family left for church, and the man was alone in his cozy country home. He glanced out the window at the cold and snowy scene outside, and he turned to warm himself by the fire. But as he turned, his eye caught something. It was movement outside, and he goes to the window, and it was cats. 3 young cats were trapped outside. And so he thought, "Oh my gosh, they're going to freeze to death." And so he puts on his hat, he puts on his coat, he opens the door, gets this rush of cold air. And he says, come here, cats, come inside where it's warm and you can have food. You'll die out there." But the cats run away. He was just a stranger. He walked outside more and he says, "Come back, do not be afraid, I want to save you." But the cats were gone. It was too late. "Well, I did everything I could for them," he muttered to himself. "What more could I do? I'd have to become a cat myself in order to reach them and save them. If I become a cat, I could tell them and show them that then they would believe me unless they were fools." And just as he reached the door, church bells rang in the distance. The man paused for a second and he listened. He went inside and he warmed himself by the fire and he got down on his knees. You know, last Thursday, I was feeling the anxiety and the worry of this season. And I was feeling it in my back and my shoulders. And that day, someone in my family really needed something, and they needed it right now. And everyone else was busy except for me. And so, as I was just about ready to head out the door, someone in my family said, "Are you okay?" And I just looked at them and I said, "The capacity for me to add anything extra right now is pretty thin." But I went and I got the item and I dropped it off. And as I was driving between the two towns, I began to think of this sermon. And I thought of the song, "Don't Worry, Be Happy." And I'll tell you, it did work because I was not happy at that point. And then I thought of what Paul said, how we should give our worries and our anxieties to God. And no, I didn't hear church bells in the distance. But I began to think and imagine, how would Jesus handle this situation? Maybe be a bit more kind. Maybe be a bit more gentle. Maybe have a sense of peace, because the worry and the anxiety and, of course, the extra responsibilities that I was feeling right at that moment was taken off my shoulders and was given to God. And I can tell you, in that moment, it lightened my load, and I smiled a little bit. And to me, that is joy. I know in a couple days it's Christmas, and you might feel finally all the weight and anxiety is lifted off. It might not happen until after Christmas. It might not happen until after the new year. It might not happen until this season is over. It might not happen until you go and see somebody. But I ask you, during this moment, so at least in this time period, choose joy. Don't worry, be happy. And of course, take your anxieties to God.